in any way, even if the negativity is produced not by drug usage, but by prohibition, any negative consequences at all that have anything to do with drugs immediately gets translated into our public discourse as something that bolsters the need to keep drugs criminalized. Because if we decriminalize, there'll be more drugs. And if there are more drugs, there will be more problems. So you look, for example, at what's happening in Mexico and the southern border of the United States, the extreme violence that's taking place as a result not of drug use, but of prohibition policies. In the public mind, those problems get linked just vaguely to drugs, and with the assumption embedded into place that decriminalization will lead to more drugs, automatically in the public mind, what is occurring in Mexico is a further reason to bolster and maintain our criminalization scheme. And so to me, the central question in terms of having an impact on the drug policy debate is not the ideological issues of whether there's legitimacy to criminalizing drug use. That's important, and I have my own views on that, but that seems to be firmly embedded into place. And it's not the moral issue of is drug usage inherently wrong, or do we want to encourage or discourage drug use, because that too is a fairly static question. The question that I think matters is this assumption accurate about what will occur if there's decriminalization? Namely, will there be this massive explosion of drug usage on the part of our youth and our adult population, or is that a myth? And I think the only way to move past the speculative realm and to answer that in an adult and serious fashion is to look at the results of decriminalization that have existed in the real world and that exist now. And one finds that in Portugal. And that's why, to me, the idea of going there and actually finding out what have been the actual results was such a compelling project. One of the most interesting aspects of decriminalization in Portugal that I found, and I didn't expect this, was decriminalization took place in 2001. That's when it became effective. And I'm going to walk through in just a minute the events that led up to that. But the impetus behind decriminalization in Portugal was not that it's in a very socially progressive country that decided to have an interesting libertarian experiment. And they decided to decriminalize on the principle that the state has no business in interfering in the private choices of adult citizens. That had nothing to do with the impetus for decriminalization. Nor was Portugal, or is Portugal, some sort of idyllic upper middle class nirvana where decriminalization could be tried without much risk. I mean, this is not Luxembourg or Monaco. Portugal actually is one of the poorest countries, Western European countries, if not the poorest, EU member states in all of Western Europe. They've long had extreme poverty-related social pathologies and problems. And in fact, the 1990s in Portugal saw probably one of the most acute and severe and uncontrollable problems with drug addiction and drug-related pathologies. They, throughout the 1990s, saw an increase in almost every metric that drug policymakers look at in terms of usage, prevalence rates, sexually transmitted diseases related to drugs, drug-related crimes, drug-related death. It was spiraling out of control. And the more they criminalized and the more resources they devoted to arresting and prosecuting and imprisoning drug users, the more acute the problems were becoming. And you can look at charts, some of which I include in my report, that detail what happened in the 1990s, that every bad metric continued steadily and often severely to increase as criminalization intensified. And so there was no sense that, well, we need to decriminalize on ideological grounds or as an experiment. There was desperation on the part of policymakers, much like there is in the United States now, that no matter what it was that they were trying, no matter how much they fortified their criminalization framework, the worse the problems became. And so what they decided to do is to form a commission in 1998 that was composed of the most apolitical policymaking and medical and psychological experts that they could find. And the mandate of that commission was not to determine whether decriminalization was a good idea. The mandate was to examine the failures of their drug policy and determine what changes ought to be made and what optimal policies were available in order to stem the tide of their terrible drug problems. And this commission got together, and there were people from all backgrounds and previous beliefs and orientations about what drug policy ought to entail, and they studied the problem in as empirical a sense as they could, because their mandate was to strip the ideological and moral questions away and ground whatever their assessments were in purely empirical analyses. And what they concluded was that decriminalization wasn't the right thing to do politically or conceptually, that decriminalization was the policy that would most effectively enable the Portuguese government to get a hold of the spiraling and out of control problems with drug addiction and drug-related pathologies. It was a purely utilitarian calculus that decriminalization would be the most effective course of action. The one thing I want to add to that is that they decided from the beginning, they resolved from the beginning not to have any preconceived notions about what policies were likely to work, that they would just simply be taken to wherever their analysis led them. The only exception being that from the very start they took legalization as opposed to decriminalization off the table. That was the only option that they resolved that they could not and should not consider. And the reason for that is because there are all sorts of international treaties and international conventions and other kinds of international legal obligations to which Portugal and every other country is bound that essentially compel countries to maintain a legal prohibition against drug usage, such that legalization would be inconsistent with those treaty obligations. And in fact, there's an argument to make, and some people make it, and it's, though not persuasive, it could be said to be reasonable that even decriminalization, even the act of taking drug usage out of the criminal realm, though keeping on the books a legal prohibition, is also inconsistent with international conventions. There's drug policymakers in the United States and even some in Western Europe who argue that, but the Portuguese decided that decriminalization would be consistent with their treaty obligations, though legalization would not. And so it's possible that legalization would have ended up being the policy they ultimately embraced, but that option was taken off the table. So this commission produced a report in 1998 that emphatically concluded that decriminalization was the optimal policy approach. A council of ministers, essentially a cabinet, was then formed by the Portuguese president to review those recommendations and issue their own report as to whether those recommendations ought to be adopted. These were politicians, not merely policymakers shielded from political pressures. And they too concluded almost in its entirety that the Commission's recommendations were persuasive and ought to be adopted. And that then led in October of 2000 to the Portuguese Parliament overwhelmingly enacting the decriminalization framework that the Commission and then the Council of Ministers recommended. And it was then signed into law by the Portuguese president and took effect on July 1st, 2001. So it was an extraordinarily pragmatic and rational approach that led to decriminalization and purposely stripped of its political and ideological components. One of the interesting aspects of the pre-decriminalization debate was that it very much resembled what the drug policy debates are like in the United States and what you could imagine they would be like if decriminalization became a serious option. As I said before, Portugal is not some socially progressive country. They have a very short history of democracy, in fact. There was dictatorship in Portugal up until the mid-70s. The Catholic Church plays a very prominent and influential role in their political and religious life. And so there were the kinds of arguments that one would expect to be made against decriminalization from prominent politicians. There was the argument that it would lead to an explosion and an increase in drug usage, that it would be a signal to the population that the government approved of drug usage. One of the principal concerns and fears was that Lisbon would become a haven for drug tourism, that European youth would flock to Lisbon with the excited prospect that they could use drugs freely. And so those kind of concerns needed to be overcome. And as the empirical conclusions, I think, pretty compellingly demonstrate, those fears turned out to be entirely unfounded. Those predictions ended up being false. And so what you now have in Portugal, despite a very ideologically diverse political class, from conservatives to far left and socialists, is a virtually unanimous consensus that decriminalization has been a success. There's almost no movement of any kind among any influential or popular Portuguese political faction to reverse decriminalization and return to a criminalized scheme because they've seen the two worlds and they've been able to see which one works far better, and that is decriminalization. And I think that fact alone is extremely compelling in terms of their own experience. Let me just say a couple words about Portugal beyond what I've said already. I think anytime in the United States there's a suggestion that we ought to look to some other country in order to see whether or not something works or doesn't work, in order to inform ourselves about things that we might not have given sufficient thought to, there's immediately this objection that's made. It's very common, I've heard it already in some of the preliminary discussions I've had over this report, that what works in other countries doesn't work in the United States, that there's something exceptional about our culture and our political system and our citizenry that really means that every other country is basically irrelevant in terms of understanding what might work here. Or at the very least, if not to that extreme, that it's irrelevant, that the fact that a certain policy works in another country doesn't mean in any compelling way that it will work here, because there are such differences between the two countries. And you can, in fact, identify differences between Portugal and the United States. To begin with, Portugal is a country that's relatively quite small. It has a total population of 10 million people versus 300 million people in the United States. There is ethnic and racial homogeneity in Portugal that obviously stands in fairly stark contrast to the United States population. There's religious homogeneity. Overwhelmingly, it's a Catholic population. And so those are differences. But one of the things that you learn in the first year of law school, every first-year law student can describe this concept to you, is that when you attempt to use judicial precedent as instruction as to what you ought to do now, you have a legal problem and you look to prior cases and what courts have said in the past about similar legal problems, people who are untrained in the art of legal reasoning will sometimes try and find differences that don't really mean anything and that have no real distinction. So you might, the sort of classic fallacy is to say, well, in that case there, the plaintiff had brown hair, and in this case here, the plaintiff had blonde hair. And that, of course, is a difference, but it's a difference without any meaningful distinction whatsoever. And so I think if somebody wants to say that the success in Portugal of drug decriminalization somehow doesn't translate into the United States because of population size differences or ethnic and racial homogeneity differences, the burden is on that person to explain why not just that difference exists, but why it actually matters, why it actually means that it's unlikely to be instructive in terms of how it will work in the United States. I mean, I think, and I think most drug counselors and professionals in the field of psychology agree, that drug addiction and the behavior surrounding it is fairly universal. In fact, it's certainly more similar than it is different. And if governments are able to successfully address the problem of drug addiction using decriminalization in Western Europe, a culture that is certainly similar to the United States, if not close to identical in every meaningful way, that's certainly very compelling evidence that it will work here. And I think if someone wants to object and say that there are differences between the two countries, it's incumbent upon whoever's doing that, whoever's making that argument, to say why those differences are actual impediments. Why, for example, a racially diverse population means that decriminalization is less likely to succeed than a country with a racially or ethnically homogenized population, because I don't see any argument as to justify that claim. Just a word about the reasons why drug decriminalization was something that these policymakers in Portugal thought would be successful. Because what you can do is you can use statistical analysis in all sorts of ways. And you can say, here's 2001 when decriminalization was implemented, and here are some charts, some pretty graphs and bar graphs showing that the problems of drug addiction have declined, and HIV and hepatitis transmission related to drug addiction and drug usage has remained fairly steady. And you can make statistical arguments in that way. But people believe that decriminalization will worsen drug-related problems almost intuitively. So unless you can provide reasons why decriminalization is likely to improve these problems, I think the ability to persuade is much less. than if you can actually provide reasons.